We are coming to the end of what I hope has been a very stimulating and productive conference for everyone. I've certainly enjoyed it. The rain was a nuisance, but also something that encouraged us to stay indoors and attend the conference. So Nancy planned that for us, so that's a good thing. I'm very pleased to introduce our keynote speaker tonight. Dr. Vijay Prashad is George and Martha Kellner Chair in South Asian History and a professor of international studies at Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut. Prashad is the author of 11 books, most recently The Darker Nations, A People's History of the Third World. And he is a contributing editor for the Kathmandu-based Himal, where he writes regular book reviews. In addition, he writes regularly for the US-based website Counterpunch and occasionally for Zenit and Colorlines magazine. The title of Dr. Prashad's talk tonight is It's Just Night After All, Reflections on a Post-American World.
Don't stop clapping because I think before we stop clapping, we should clap for Alex for producing a superb conference. Really superb. And also, Nancy is not here. Nancy is not here. Okay, well done, Nancy. Okay. So when Alex called me and said, will you come to Beirut, my mind immediately went to my favorite poet in the world, Faz Ahmed Faz, who had lived here in the 1970s and early 1980s. And immediately I think I said to you, Alex, I will definitely come here because it's Faz's city after all. This is a city where he was in exile as a Pakistani communist, radical, already a poet of some reputation, great reputation. He had come to Beirut to edit the magazine Lotus, which was an important magazine of the Afro-Asian project. And it's from that magazine that I, for instance, learned about Hikmet, the Turkish poet. I read Ding Ling first in Lotus. Lotus was a little bit like the UNESCO Courier, which I don't know how many of you were able to become cosmopolitan through it. But the UNESCO Courier was very important. It was available for free, thanks to the good offices of the United Nations. And it was available in, I think, every conceivable language that was necessary, maybe. They could have had more. But so, of course, I was happy to come. It was in Beirut that Faz met many radical people and also, expanded his own understanding of different struggles, including, at that point, a dynamic Yasser Arafat. He also met in Beirut Edward Said. He met in Beirut Iqbal Ahmed again, Iqbal Ahmed, of course, whom he knew. And he met Fawaz Trabulsi, who unfortunately has a cold and cannot be here, but he met Fawaz in Beirut as well. So I thought, look, I'm going to come here, and when in 1982 there was the Israeli invasion, Faz wrote, to my mind, quite a beautiful poem which had not been translated, so I decided to struggle to translate it. And only because Junaid said it's okay to read it in Urdu, I'll first read it in Urdu and then I'll give you my miserable translation and you can make of it what you will. But that's not what my paper is about, which I'll read after that. That is just the prelude. And I'm glad fantastic anthropologists like Mahsoon is here. They are appreciative of poetry, so I hope you will enjoy Faz. So I'll read this to you. Then I'll give you a sense of the project that I've been working on for the last several years, which is, in a sense, to rewrite some part of the 20th century history from the standpoint of elsewhere, not the standpoint of Europe, but other places, maybe. And that project, if you, begins in around the 1920s, my history, and the first volume, Darker Nations, ended in 1983. And I've just finished the second volume, which starts, like every good historian, doesn't start 1983, it starts 1973. Some parts have to be rewritten and goes up to the present. So what I'm going to present to you is the full narrative from 1920s to the present. That will be in both the books, as it were. And you may say, what does this have to do with America? America is the phantom in this story. And like the ghost who walks, it's up to you to uncover where America resides. America is not elsewhere. Sometimes it is elsewhere, but not often. Okay, so that's what I'll do. But first, the prelude. There's a little poem first from Mere Dil Mere Musafir, which My Heart, My Traveler, which Faiz, those are the poems he largely wrote in Beirut. And the little poem is, Dil na ummeed to nahi, nakam hi to hai, lambi hai gam ki sham, magar sham hi to hai. And from that I got my title. But it's just a fight after all. The night of suffering lengthens, but it is just night after all. I haven't lost hope. It's ironic that two of Faiz's books are poems written in jail. And in some ways, I find the Beirut book to be more sad for reasons which we'll talk later. Anyway, the poem I translated, this is the prelude. It's called Ek Nagma Karbala-e Beirut ke liye, a song for the battlefield of Beirut. So first I'll give you the Urdu, then I'll give you the English. Beirut, Nigar-e Bazm-e-Jahan, Beirut, Badil-e-Baag-e-Jinan, बच्चों की हस्ती आँखों से जो आईना चिकनाचूर हुई, अब उनकी सितारों के लौ से इस शहर की रातें रोशन हैं और रक्षान है अर्ज़ लेबनान, बेरूट निगार बज़्म जहान, जो चेहरे लहू के घाजे की जीनत से सिवा पुरनूर हुई, अब उनकी रंगीन परतू से इस शहर की गलियाँ रोशन है और तबान है अर्ज़ लेबनान, बेरूट निगार बज़्म जहान, हर वीरां घर हर एक खानदार हम पाया एक कसर ए दारा है, हर घाजी रक्श अस्कंदर है, हर दुख्तार हमसर ए लैला है, ये शहर अजाल से कयाम है, ये शहर आबाद तक दयाम है, बेरूट निगार बज़्म जहां, Beirut, Badil-e-Baag-e-Jinan. Beirut, ornament of our world, Beirut, exquisite as paradise's gardens, those mirrors that shattered because of the smiling eyes of children, बच्चों की हस्ती आँखों से, नहीं? वो तो है ना? Those mirrors that shattered because of the smiling eyes of children are now starlit. This city's nights are bright and luminous is Lebanon, or Rakshan hai Arz-e Lebanon, Beirut, ornament of our world. Faces decorated with blood, dazzling, beyond beauty. Their elegant splendor lights up the city's lanes, and radiant is Lebanon, or Taban hai Arz-e Lebanon. Beirut, ornament of our world. Every deserted house, every ruin is equal to Darius's citadels. Every warrior brings envy to Alexander. Every daughter is like Layla. This city stands at time's creation. This city will stand at time's end. Beirut, ornament of our world. Beirut, exquisite as paradise's gardens. Ye शहर अज़ल से क़याम है, ये शहर आबाद तक दयाम है, बेरूट निगार बज़्म जहान, बेरूट बदील बाग जिनान. Faiz Ahmed Faiz. Normally I don't read out my translations, they are for my private use, but in this case it was an opportunity not to be missed. Somebody should translate it into Arabic. That would be good. I think Faiz would be happy then. Nahi Malini, he would enjoy that. Part 1, the Third World Project. In 1928, the anti-colonial leaders gathered in Brussels for a meeting of the League Against Imperialism. This was the first attempt to create a global platform to unite the visions of the anti-colonial movements from Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Considerations of expediency and the convulsions of World War II blocked any progress on such a platform. It would have to wait till 1955 in Bandung, Indonesia, when a smattering of newly independent or almost independent African and Asian countries sent their leaders to confer on a planetary agenda. The Bandung dynamic inaugurated the Third World Project, a seemingly incoherent set of demands that were actually very carefully worked out through the institutions of the United Nations and what would become, in 1961, the non-aligned movement. The central concept for the new nations was the Third World. The Third World was not a place, it was a project. Galvanized by the mass movements and by the failures of capitalist maldevelopment, the leadership in the darker nations looked to each other for another agenda. Politically, they wanted more planetary democracy. No more the serfs of their colonial masters. They wanted to have a voice and power on the world stage. What did that voice say? It spoke of three main elements. First, peace. It had become apparent by the mid-1950s and early 1960s that the Cold War between the two superpowers was catastrophic for the planet. Not only might the nuclear-fueled confrontation result in Armageddon, but the sheer wastage of human resources and social resources on the arms race would distort the possibility of proper human development. By the early 1950s, the United States spent 10% of its gross domestic product on its defense sector, a development that raised the ire of President Eisenhower, who bemoaned at the end of the decade about the growth of the military-industrial complex. This complex did not end at the borders of the United States. It had ambitions for the planet, wanting to sell arms to every country and to insinuate a security complex over the social agenda of the Third World Project. No wonder that the first concrete task after the formation of the non-aligned movement in Belgrade in 1961 was to send India's Nehru and Ghana's Nkrumah to Moscow and Indonesia's Sukarno and Mali's Keita to Washington, carrying the non-aligned movement's appeal for peace. Kennedy and Khrushchev offered the typical bromides, but did not reverse the tensions that intensified with the building of the Berlin Wall and the tank standoff at Checkpoint Charlie. The Third World Project kept faith with the Bandung Communique, which called for the regulation, limitation, control, and reduction of all armed forces and armaments, including the prohibition of the production, experimentation, and use of all weapons of mass destruction, and to establish effective institutional controls to this end. That was part of the Bandung Communique. The International Atomic Energy Agency of 1957 was a child of Bandung and a cornerstone of the Third World Project. So first, peace. Second, bread. The new nations of Africa and Asia and the renewed national agendas of Latin America explicitly recognized that the countries they had seized were impoverished. Any direction forward would have to confront the legacies of colonial economy, with the advantages seized by the Atlantic powers and the trade rules drawn up to benefit those historical, not comparative, advantages. Economists like Raul Prebisch of Argentina, who would become the first Director General of the UN Conference on Trade and Development, challenged the Atlantic institutions, such as the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, GATT, and the IMF, which Prebisch called a conspiracy against the laws of the market. When Prebisch took the helm at UNCTAD, the economic arm, by the way, the word conspiracy is his, not mine. When I use the word conspiracy, I always have to say, you know what I mean, I don't mean. But Prebisch, head of UNCTAD, said the IMF is a conspiracy against the laws of the market. When Prebisch took the helm at UNCTAD, the economic arm of the Third World Project, he announced the need for a new order in the international economy so that the market functions properly, not only for the big countries, but the developing countries in their relations with the developed. It was out of this general framework that the Third World fought for the revision of the free trade agenda, for better commodity prices, for primary goods cartels such as OPEC, for commodity prices, for more generous policy, for the transfer of investment and technology from the north to the south. By the way, this center is funded by a man whose father was known as the Red Prince. I don't know how many of you know the history of the Al-Walid Senior, but he was the Red Prince who was friendly with a very interesting character, the Saudi Minister of Petrochemicals. I think his name was Abdullah Al-Tariq, I think. He was known as the Red Sheikh because Abdullah Al-Tariq and Perez Alfonso from Venezuela met at a meeting in Cairo, in the suburbs of southern Cairo, and they, on a napkin, hatched the plan for OPEC. The OPEC cartel was supposed to be one cartel. There was supposed to be chocolate cartel, copper cartel, bauxite cartel. Everything failed except OPEC, and then you know where OPEC went. But initially it was to be a commodity cartel to fight against corporate cartels. Okay. Fought at each turn by the Atlantic powers, the Third World took refuge in the UN General Assembly with the 1973 New International Economic Order Resolution. It was the highest point of the Third World Project. So first peace, then bread, and finally justice. The non-aligned movement, created in 1961, was designed as the secretariat of the Third World Project, with the Group of 77, created in 1964, to act on its behalf in the United Nations. The founders of the non-aligned movement, Nehru of India, Nasser of Egypt, Sukarno of Indonesia, and Tito of Yugoslavia, recognized that little of their agenda would be able to move forward without a more democratic international structure. The UN, they felt, had been hijacked by the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. The IMF and the World Bank had been captured from the formation by the Atlantic powers. And the GATT, the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, was designed to undermine any attempt by the new nations to revise the international economic order. It was hoped that NAM, the non-aligned movement, and their Group of 77 would put pressure on the West and the East to afford political space to the new nations. But, of course, it was not to be. Nigeria's minister to the UN in the 1960s, Jaja Wachukwu, chided his fellows for their acceptance of the inequality within the United Nations. Are we going to remain veranda boys, he asked, watching from the balcony as the 5 members controlled the debate within the United Nations. Peace, bread, justice. That was the Third World Project. It came to the world stage on shaky terrain. The houses of the new nations were not in order. Lack of democracy in their own political worlds, combined with mismanagement of economic resources and a very shallow reconstruction of the social landscape, constrained the new nations. The old social classes hesitated before the anti-colonial mass movements. But as these movements were demobilized, the old elite called on the generals or on right-wing populist politicians to sweep up the mess. The project was hampered by these failings, but it was not these limitations that did it in. What did the project in was the Atlantic project. So part 2. Part 2. There is a head quote which I have waited for years to use. This is from my favorite Henry Kissinger. 1964. Nothing good. Nothing important can come from the South. I found this about 15 years ago, and it's been in my diary. I've been waiting. So, nothing important can come from the South. Henry Kissinger, 1964. In 1975, the 7 leaders of the major advanced industrial countries met in the Château de Rambouillet in France to decide the fate of the planet. They were the Group of 7, what we today call the G7. The United States, the United Kingdom, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, and Canada. The Rambouillet gathering was their first formal meeting as the G7. Mark that this is in 1975. The G7 leaders were detained by 4 facts 3 of them were encumbrances that they wished to do away with. And I list the first 3, and the 4th comes. The first fact was the social democratic agenda. Many of them had emerged from this agenda, but now saw that it had become too expensive. What had become expensive was not only the social wages that had to be paid to the public, but also the wage packets to entitled and increasingly restive workers. Strike days in the early 70s rose in Europe and in parts of the United States. So the first encumbrance was the social democratic agenda. The second encumbrance was the communist agenda, which had become, to be fair, much more accommodating to the capitalist project, but was yet able to offer an alternative to some entitled workers. Third, the Third World Project, whose most recent instantiation, remember they are meeting in 1975, whose most recent instantiation, the oil weapon of 1973, and the demand for a new international economic order, the resolution in the UN, also in 1973, had come as a genuine shock that this was possible. These 3 horizons, as far as the G7 was concerned, needed to be disbanded. The 4th encumbrance, the 4th problem, was a more general one, and it ended up being the solution to their other 3 irritants, and that was the new geography of production. So, lucky for me, I could read the summary of their conversation, because the Gerald Ford Library has these sitting available for you. But they don't know that you're going to read this 30, 40, 30 years later. So this is from the Gerald Ford Library. Gerald Ford, who was then the hapless president of the United States, Gerald Ford opened the conversation at Rambouillet with a plea that the main thrust for them had to be for the leaders, and this is Gerald Ford speaking, the leaders had to ensure that the current, I wish I could speak with all the accents. Nahin? First Kissinger, now Ford. I don't even know what Ford sounds like. Every time I saw him, he looked deadly boring. I never took him seriously. Anyway, Gerald Ford speaking. Leaders to ensure that the current world economic situation is not seen as a crisis in the democratic or capitalist system. Okay, it's very important. The crisis of the early 70s should not be seen as a crisis of capitalism, crisis of democracy. That had to be fought against. It was an ideological campaign, he's saying, he's launching. The G7 had to prevent the capitalist crisis from becoming a political one. It had to be handled as a technical economic problem. This was all very well as rhetoric, but it was not a salve to the more realistic people in the room. And here comes the Social Democrats. Helmut Schmidt, first before Schmidt, Harold Wilson of the United Kingdom spoke at length. Also, is nominal Social Democrat. Then Helmut Schmidt comes. He was a socialist formerly and Chancellor of West Germany. So he takes the floor. And I'm going to read now a little bit from Helmut Schmidt. This is very interesting, so I'll spend some. Harold Wilson of the UK, you talked of viable industries and indicated that this excluded lame ducks. You referred to textiles as an example. I am a close friend of the chairman of the Textile Workers Union in Germany. It is a union of a shrinking industry. I would hope that this would not be repeated outside this room. Sorry. He only hoped it, he didn't command it. So, given the high level of wages in Europe, I cannot help but believe that in the long run, textile industries here will have to vanish. We cannot ward off cheaper competition from outside. It is a pity because it is viable. Capital invested in a job in the textile industry in Germany is as high as it is in the German steel mills. But wages in East Asia are very low compared with ours. The German textile industry is viable, but will vanish in 10 or 12 years. Now, whatever you may think of Helmut Schmidt, he had his finger on the pulse of history, because this is precisely what happens to Germany textile. Or he colluded to make it possible. So, whether it's foresight or collusion, it doesn't really matter. Not for me. What matters is the emergence of the new geography of production, namely the disarticulation of northern Fordism, the emergence of satellite and undersea cable technology, the containerization of ships and other technological shifts that enabled firms to take advantage of differential wage rates. In Schmidt's case, the wages of East Asia. So this is familiar stuff. It is often taken as the ground for the emergence of neoliberalism. From David Harvey's introduction, very useful primer, we get the impression that neoliberalism was experimented with during the New York municipal crisis, and then, via the IMF and its friends, exported to the rest of the planet. This is not the full story. What Harvey does not have is the necessary demise of the Third World Project, and so the opening up of the countries of the South to the new geography of production. They were not just waiting there to be adopted. They had to be broken first. See, Harvey assumed there's a geography outside, that once the technology facilitated it, you could move jobs overseas. But these political projects also had to be broken before they would accept this kind of thing. What Harvey doesn't have is the necessary demise of the Third World Project. Okay. Resistance to transnational corporations had been quite strong till the late 1970s, when the Third World Project went into a tailspin, assassinated by the enforced debt crisis. You might recall that the United Nations Center on Transnational Corporations spent its energy for 3 decades to define a code of conduct for transnational firms. It was substantially dissolved in 1992 and became a fixer for corporations rather than a regulator of their business practices. All they did in 3 decades, most impressive work, is collect data on transnational corporations. And I challenge anybody to get access to that archive. Neoliberalism had a polycentric revival. At the G7, yes, but as well in the capitals of the Pacific Rim and in the emergent locomotives of the South, in Brazil, India, South Africa, China. The ruling classes in these societies had, like their European and American cousins, long wanted to abandon the cultural strictures of old nationalism, the requirements of the social democratic welfare state in the Atlantic sector, and the requirements of the anti-colonial Third World Project in the continents of Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Small pockets of elite opinion harbored resentment at the anti-colonial heritage. Out of these pockets came new intellectual agendas, including the revival of the Hayek school of liberalism, namely that the state must be excluded from economic activity as much as possible. And then, of course, the neo-Hayek is the state must be utilized for the privilege of the rich, etc. Cultural ideas of individualism and enterprise were celebrated in the emergent media at the expense of the national liberation ideas of socialism and the collective good. The impatient elites wanted to set themselves apart from the obligations of the post-colonial. They wanted to live, as the Indian poet Nizam Ezekiel put it, at jazzy picnics, cooking on a smoky stove, shooing beggars from the backroom wall. It was fitting, and by the way, this city has demonstrated how you can shoo beggars from the wall, build massive buildings, cut the view of the beautiful sea. It's a marvelous, in a way, laboratory for being at a jazzy picnic and shooing the beggars. It was fitting for them that the new post-colonial states had failed in so many ways. The failures were used as a measure to push for their own agendas. These elites produced their own neoliberalism in response to the same debt crisis that opened their countries up to the factories of the North. By the 1980s, the reinvigorated Atlantic Bloc aggressively fought back against the non-aligned movement and all talk of a new international economic order. At the Cancun summit in 1981, to discuss the ill-starred Brand Report, which was the first great report on North-South relations, chaired by Chancellor Willy Brandt of West Germany. At the Cancun summit, to discuss the Brand Report, Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher came to throw down the gauntlet. Initially, Reagan didn't want to go. But if you read their correspondence, Thatcher is begging him, and then eventually Reagan comes. Very important that Reagan be there. Reagan mocked the proceedings because he was an incredibly good politician. People didn't estimate how he was able to make the entire conference about himself. It became just about Reagan. There were serious discussions. At one point, Nyerere gets deeply frustrated and says, "Mr. President," and Reagan, one-liner, takes over. Reagan mocked the proceedings, particularly those, this is his great line, who mistake compassion for development and claim massive transfers of wealth somehow miraculously will produce new well-being. He kept hammering this point. You believe in miracles. We keep sinking money into you. It goes nowhere. You think it's a miracle, you know. The North-South dialogue effectively ended. The corridors of the IMF and the World Bank were scrubbed clean of old Keynesians and developmentalists. Only marginalists and neoliberal thinkers were welcome into the leadership. Questions of history and sociology were of no consequence. GDP was the only variable that mattered. At the IMF, Johannes Witteveen gave way to Jacques de Larosière, and at the World Bank, Tom Clausen and Anna Kruger washed the stains left by Robert McNamara. Even Robert McNamara, they found unacceptable. Liberalism was shown the door. The UN, too, had to be cleansed. When he briefed Daniel Patrick Moynihan for his new UN post, Henry Kissinger told him, and this is again recorded in their conversation, Kissinger, Nixon, and Moynihan in the room together. Kissinger tells Moynihan, "We need a strategy. In principle, I think we should move things from the General Assembly to the Security Council. It is important to see that we have our confidence and nerve." And Moynihan was a master of this process because he was able to use one UN resolution, that is the resolution on Zionism, as an effective weapon to delegitimize the General Assembly. And he wrote, I think, fairly important memoir called, his memoir at time of the UN, it's called A Dangerous Place. Okay. Kissinger tells Moynihan, the US has to get hold of the specialized agencies, such as UNCTAD, the UN Conference on Trade and Development, and UNESCO, and turn them to the business civilization of the North. Having excised the institutional threats to the Atlantic Project, the G7 moved to use the debt crisis of the 1980s to its advantage and to push through a new intellectual property and trade regime to consolidate the gains of the North against the South. By the time the NAM met in New Delhi in 1983, the exhaustion of the Third World Project before the fierce thrust of the North was evident. There was to be no effective political strategy to deal with the debt crisis, with the southern countries willing, out of political necessity, to see the Club of Paris and the Club of London one by one, to get their structural adjustment orders so as to extend their credit lines. More radical voices, such as everybody's hero Fidel Castro. I went to Durban for the World Conference Against Racism. He walks into the NGO room. Full quarter of the delegates are from the United States, standing ovation. A few hours later, I went to the ministerial meeting. He walks in, standing ovation. In 1983, he said, we should have a debtors' strike. We should all collectively refuse to pay the banks back. Everybody clapped, but nobody followed him. The problem was not the debt itself. After all, today, the total external debt of the developing countries stands at $1.38 trillion, whereas the total external debt of France alone is $1.2 trillion. The problem lies with the power asymmetry, with France able to refinance debt via favorable rates from the bank cartels, plus lower risk premiums relative to other countries. The North could command the banks. That was the big difference at that time. Rather than a South-led new international economic order, the world had to live with a North-led new international property order. The Uruguay round of the General Agreement of Trade and Tariffs, GATT, changed the intellectual property regime so that reverse engineering or transfer of technology became illegal. The North and its businesses would be able to outsource the production of commodities to the South, but the bulk of the profits for their sale would be preserved as rent for intellectual property. This was the process that produced so-called jobless growth in the North and led to its debt-fueled consumerism for its vast mass, a social imbalance that has now exploded, first through the housing market and soon through the personal credit market. In 1981, the new Secretary General of the United Nations, Javier Pérez de Quelar, called the gap between North and South a breach of the most fundamental human rights and pledged that the UN would work to bridge the gap. The UN, by now under Atlantic tutelage, did no such thing. Part 3, the South Project. I don't know how many of you have seen Mohammad Lakhdar Hamina's Chronicle of a Year on Fire. It's a very interesting film. Okay, yeah, of course you've seen it. Suhail has seen all these third worldist movies from the 70s. 1975. In the movie, it's an Algerian movie, by the way. It's a superb movie. Yeah, because you've seen it as well. Yeah. So there's a scene where a crazy man, a prophet perhaps, emerges from the city to greet a horde of bedraggled peasants. He extends his arms and says, "You were poor and free, but now you are only poor." Part 3, the South Project. Now you are only poor. In 1989, the poor from the hillside settlements around Caracas, Venezuela, rose in revolt against the rise in bus fares, spurred on by an increase in petrol prices. This was the most spectacular of the IMF or bread riots, and also perhaps the first that becomes self-consciously against neoliberalism. More such protests and rebellions shaped the social world on all the continents, now increasingly, in our time, in the Atlantic world, as we see with the social convulsions in Club Med, from Spain to Greece, with the Tea Party in the United States, Occupy movement, Indignados. What united these protests from 1989 to the present? That's how I see these movements in Europe. These are linked to Caracas, 1989. That was the opening. First major self-conscious revolt against neoliberalism. What unites these protests were at least 5 processes, or are 5 processes. First, I'm sorry if there's too much economics. Some of you are not, in American studies, people are like, let us deal with culture. Economics is too boring. I started with a poem. Now, that was the prophylactic. Now is the real medicine. What united these protests were at least 5 processes. First, enforced austerity regimes, pushed first in Africa, Asia, Latin America under the name of structural adjustment, and then more recently in the Atlantic world under the name of balanced budgets and fiscal responsibility. But it's the same process. Second, catastrophic unemployment in pockets of these societies, particularly in rural areas, where factory farming has de-skilled work through the use of expensive and unsustainable technological inputs. The international labor organizations, only I read these reports for you, okay? I spend my whole day reading UN reports to summarize for you. So appreciate how much work goes into this summary, okay? The international, if you read an ILO report, you tell me, I have to have my eyes checked every week. The International Labour Organization's 2011 report suggests a vulnerable unemployment rate of 50.3%. 50.3% global rate. The ILO has called for a global jobs pact with greater public investment in infrastructure and what it says, a stronger, more globally consistent supervisory and regulatory framework for the financial sector so that it serves the real economy, promotes sustainable enterprises and decent work, and better protects the savings and pensions of people. As with so much that happens at the ILO, it carried no weight with the G7, where labor issues are considered basically infra-dig. Okay, so the first point is enforced austerity on the planet, really. And second, catastrophic unemployment rates. I'm concentrating your eyes on rural areas, where there's less attention because the protests are often less spectacular. And there's more police firing and killing there, but there's less media. In India, it's a vast country, huge agricultural sector. There are a handful, I can name them all, rural journalists. There's one rural affairs editor, my friend Sainath for the Hindu. Okay, it's scandalous how our eyes don't go to the rural. You know, we look at occupying city squares, liberating city squares, making manifestations, but rural areas are important. As in Egypt, where rural struggles were very important to build momentum for people, I think, including industrial areas, what is it, Mahalla and different places. But eyes are always on the city and the urban dwellers and Twitter and Facebook. We forget that in rural areas there's catastrophic unemployment. That 50.3 number, if you look at the stats, it's weighted higher in rural areas than in urban areas in some parts of the world. Third, the dominance of the finance, real estate, and insurance sector, whose fire sale of assets in the name of privatization, that's 1 in 7 people will not know where their next meal comes from. That's how they define hunger. The outgoing, gone now, FAO Director General Jacques Diouf, very interesting man, has spent his entire career on food issues, whether working on groundnut or rice or agriculture or hunger. Diouf has been a thoughtful champion of the problems of food and starvation. While releasing last year's report, his final report for the FAO, Diouf could not contain himself, and this is from Diouf. A dangerous mix of the global economic slowdown combined with stubbornly high food prices in many countries has pushed some 100 million more people than last year into chronic hunger and poverty. The silent hunger crisis affecting 1/6 of all humanity poses a serious risk for world peace and security. If you've ever been to a release of a UN report, no Director General talks like this. They generally are quite diplomatic and sedate, but this was a remarkable moment. And this is nothing, then he lets loose. He's now gone from FAO. It's hard to let loose and then stay. In 2008, food riots struck Burkina Faso, Cameroon, Egypt, Haiti, Indonesia, Philippines, Vietnam, India, Pakistan. Then Mongolia, Korea, Indonesia, they started to slash imports. You'll remember Mubarak in the end suddenly says, okay, bread prices can come down. The IMF recognized this last year in the summer. They wrote a very interesting paper that one of the spurs for the Arab rising of this last year was the rising bread prices as a result of the end to the democracy of bread. So, first, enforced austerity. Second, catastrophic unemployment. Third, the dominance of finance, insurance, real estate. Fourth, hunger. It is bad enough if one is reduced to the level of bare life, but even worse if this condition is not general across the population. Rates of social inequality are at record levels for the modern era. You're all familiar with the 1%, 99% language in the United States. Listen to this. A recent, from last month, UN report shows us that the richest 1% of adults across the planet owned 40% of global assets. 1% of global population owns 40% of global assets. And the richest 10% owned 85% of the world's total assets. The report summarizes this and says, some have predicted convergence, but the past decade has shown increasing concentration of income among people, corporations, and countries. Full stop. No judgment. One word, so those are the 5 themes. The 5th is increase inequality. One word unites the variegated protests across the planet. No. Basta. No. Finished. Khalas. From Tahrir Square to Occupy to this to Kennedy Road shack settlement in Durban to rural hamlets in Haryana, the policies of neoliberalism have been resoundingly rejected. What emerged since the 1990s has been resistance. the diffusing of the energy of neoliberal policies that emerge out of international and national institutions. The Global South, that name, comes to refer to this concatenation of protests against the theft of the commons, against the theft of human dignity and rights, against the undermining of the democratic institutions and the promises of modernity. The Global South is this world of protest, a whirlwind of creative activity. These protests have produced an opening that has no easily definable political direction. Some of it turns backward, taking refuge in imagined unities of the past or in the divine realm, seek to survive in the present. And yet others find the present intolerable and nudge us to the future. So, coming back to the earlier history, how has the non-aligned movement, now 50 years old, reacted to these developments? Has it been able to break out of the defensive posture that marked it since the 1980s? At the 2006 Havana NAM summit, Venezuela's Hugo Chavez called for the creation of a new commission to study the current situation and to propose an agenda that will not, he said, be thrown to the wind. His nod was to the South Commission. The South Commission's Secretary General was an economist from India who is now the Prime Minister of India, Dr. Manmohan Singh, and he was sitting in the NAM meeting in Havana. Years. So he was deeply, he almost ducked under his chair when Hugo Chavez says, and Dr. Manmohan Singh is sitting there, the author of the report. Okay. He nodded to the South Commission, set up by the NAM in the 1980s, chaired by Julius Nyerere, whose work in the 1980s set in motion the theory of the locomotives of the South. Although its own report, The Challenge of the South, was published on the day Iraq invaded Kuwait in 1990 and therefore was little read. That may not be the only reason it was little read. I once thought, shall I teach this book? And then I thought, no, it's too boring. The South Commission toiled in the unfavorable climate of the 1980s. Shunned by the North, the Commission made a virtue of necessity. It called for South-South cooperation. That's where the phrase comes from. With its General Secretary Manmohan Singh offering the view that the new locomotive forces have to be spawned within the South itself. It was this thinking that provided the calculations for the creation first of the Group of 15 at the 1989 NAM summit, then the IBSA group, India, Brazil, South Africa, in 2003, and eventually the BRICS formation, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, at the 2009 inaugural BRICS summit. I know Goldman Sachs coined the term first, but now there are actually summits held in the name of BRICS. These were seen as the locomotives of the South. The IMF's 2011 report suggests that by 2016, the United States, I told you it's coming, like the phantom, it was always there. Now it is. The IMF's 2011 report suggests that by 2016, the United States will no longer be the largest economy in the world. They have put a date, 2016. This is, as the historian Ferdinand Braudel put it, the sign of autumn for Atlantic hegemony. Signals of decline are visible in the fragile economic fundamentals in the Atlantic states, with the red light of caution burning bright over the dominance of finance in the economy and the increase in military spending. Since 2001, the United States alone has spent $7.6 trillion on its wars and its national security apparatus. 7.6 trillion in 10 years. This comes alongside massive cuts in social spending and in tax breaks to the rich. Listen to this statistic. In 2011, the top 1% in the United States that filed taxes earned an average tax cut. The top 1% earned an average tax cut that is greater than the average income of the 99%. So you made more in a tax break than somebody makes in income. Okay, that's your tax cuts. When you talk about Bush-era tax cut, this is what it means. When it became clear that the United Kingdom's autumn was at hand by 1925, Winston Churchill proclaimed, "I would rather see finance less proud and industry more content." I would rather see finance less proud and industry more content. These words would apply to the domination of Wall Street, the City of London, the Frankfurt Finanzplatz, etc., over the lifeblood of social economy. By IMF projections, China will be the largest economy in 2016. But it does not appear to wish to assert itself alone now. China appears content to share the stage with the BRICS states and to push for multipolarity and economic diversity. China sometimes is like the strictest adherence to the Treaty of Westphalia. You do what you want outside, we'll do what we want inside. Okay, they are the only ones who seem to genuinely practice that. But maybe your neighbor also. But the BRICS platform, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa platform, is limited in several ways. And again, I have 4 different ways. First, the domestic policies of the BRICS state follow the general tenor of what one might consider neoliberalism with southern characteristics, with sales of commodities and low wages to workers alongside the recycled surplus turned over as credit to the North as the livelihood of its own citizens falls flat. For example, the Indian people experience high levels of poverty and hunger, and yet its growth rate is steadily increasing. Rather than turn over the social wealth in transfer payments to the rural population or in the creation of a more robust social wage, the country seems to want to follow World Bank President Robert Zelik's advice to turn over its surplus to help the global economy recover from the crisis. There is something obscene about making the locomotives of the South pull the tired wagons of the North, particularly given the North's own reticence to allow for a new surplus recycling mechanism during the debt crisis of the 1980s. Can you imagine if these countries had said, turn over your surplus to us? There was one person, Johannes Witteveen, who I mentioned earlier, very interesting conservative Dutch politician, happened to be a Sufi, who was the head of the IMF, who was fighting for a new surplus recycling mechanism. Fired. Second, so first, these societies themselves are suffering, these BRICS states, from what I consider to be neoliberalism with southern characteristics, as I described. Second, the BRICS alliance has not been able to create a new institutional foundation for the emergent authority. It continues to plead for a more democratic United Nations and for more democracy at the IMF and the World Bank. These pleas have made little headway. During the height of the financial crisis, the G8, because they added Russia, promised to disband and to use the G7 for its purposes. They said that the Toronto meeting was the last of the G7, G8 meetings, Rambouillet to Toronto. But that is now forgotten. The G8 is going to meet in Chicago this year. Somehow they forgot that Toronto was to be their last meeting, and that China and others who provided funds to the North were going to now be part of the world's executive, but that is forgotten. Anemic increases in the voting shares of the IMF did not enable the South to put forward a joint candidate to become its executive earlier this year when Christine Lagarde became the new IMF head. There was a Mexican candidate put forward, but there was nobody was serious. So that's the second, no institutional alternative. Third, the BRICS formation has not endorsed an ideological alternative to neoliberalism. There are many proposals for the creation of a more sustainable economic order, but these are left to the margins. The Rio formula for separate and differential treatment allows the South to make demands for concessions from universal policies that the North anyway refuses to endorse, not the least of which is on climate change. This is a defensive stand. That is to say, it's defensive to say we need separate and differential treatment. There is no positive alternative that has been taken forward as yet. It might emerge out of the convulsions from below, where there is little appetite for tinkering with a system that most people see as fundamentally broken. neoliberalism with southern characteristics, no institutional basis, no ideological alternative. Finally, the BRICS project has no ability to sequester the military dominance of the United States and NATO. When the UN votes to allow, quote, member states to use all necessary measures, as it did in Resolution 1973 on Libya, it essentially gives carte blanche to the Atlantic world to act with military force. There are no regional alternatives, robust regional alternatives. Regional actors might play a role, like Qatar or others, but no robust regional alternatives that have the capacity to operate. The force projection of the United States remains planetary, with bases on every continent and with the ability of the United States to strike almost anywhere. Regional mechanisms for peace and conflict resolution are weakened by the global presence, increasing global presence of NATO and the United States. Overwhelming military power translates into political power. Those are the 5 problems for the BRICS agenda. If we look into the entrails of the system, we will find that its solutions do not lie within it. Its problems are not technical, nor are they cultural. They are social problems that require political solutions. The social order of property, propriety, and power has to be radically revised. That is without question. The issue is what must be the strategy, the tactics, the way forward to a place that is not what it is now. The global south is a place of great struggle, of various tactics and strategies experimented with on the streets and in the halls of government. It is an unfinished story, one that has to have a good ending. Thank you. Enough time. Okay, if you don't want to ask any questions, I'll recite more fares, so you choose. Please ask some questions. Okay, economics is boring. Take your time. Yes, sir.
What do you think the relationship of the resistance that's being put forward in places like Afghanistan and the relationship of left forces to that, because there is a divide for those who support the right of people to resist against occupation, for example, in Pakistan, we are automatically labeled as mullahs, red mullahs. In a way, what do you think is the relationship of the new resistance movements that are coming about in that part of the world as well as in this part of the world, the general picture?
I mean, see, it's a very good question. The issue is that, yes, people are taking different forms of resistance. I mean, you are using resistance to refer to armed struggle,
Yes.
right? But there are different forms of resistance, multiple forms of resistance. These happen all over the place. They are happening in the heart of India when they feel that there's no other way forward. You know, that's just the nature of human history has shown us that. People take up arms. It was the case in earlier epochs that you could identify the enemy. There was the Lord's castle. There was a moneylender's house. You could go and overthrow the king. We don't have kings today. You can overthrow some tin pot. How will you overthrow finance capital? What will you shoot at? How many bankers will you assassinate? So, resistance movements of different kinds need a strategic understanding of the structures of domination. There's a big difference between the struggle that's on in Afghanistan and the global struggle. Afghanistan is a certain kind of theater, as it were. It is a place where, currently, in my mind, the United States has extremely parochial global ambitions, which will never allow Afghanistan to breathe. So, for instance, I wrote an article about this just last week or so on Counterpunch, laying out what I mean by, I'll tell you a few sentences. There is no question that Afghanistan requires a regional solution. There is no question that the Iranians have to actually be at the table. The Chinese have to be actually at the table. The Indians, why? Half the bureaucrats in Afghanistan trained in India. Okay, Karzai did college in Himachal, in Simla. You cannot not have Pakistan at the table. To allow Qatar, for instance, to open the liaison office is a direct finger in the eye of the Pakistani establishment. So these are the parochial planetary ambitions of America. You construct a nuclear deal with India in order to get India to vote against Iran in the International Atomic Energy Agency. But in constructing that deal, you enrage the Pakistanis and you create tension between India and Pakistan. You need them all to sit at a table to talk about Afghanistan because Pakistan needs to be there. The Afghan-Pakistan border has not been ever trusted by anybody. Afghanistan did not accept Pakistan when it was created in 1947, the only country in the region, because their border has never been fixed, right? So there is a regional issue. That is a particular problem. The people struggling in their armed violence against the United States, you know, if I may say, they are firing their guns into the air. You cannot touch the drones. Only the Iranians have been able to computer bring down a drone. Armed resistance may be its thing for certain people, but I'm not sure. I think that is plainly again resistance. We have to, as intellectuals, think much beyond that. We have to think, are we capable of imagining our movements into the next order? That is what intellectuals have to do. I don't feel the need just to promote resistance. People will do resistance. Resistance is in the nature of human dignity. We will resist oppression. Fine, resist. Now, my job is, as intellectual, as somebody with the weight of social capital invested in me by our institutions and struggles, what does this overeducated mind have to do to think about what are the possibilities, what are ways forward, how to talk to others, that I think is important. So resistance is going to happen. The real question for us as intellectuals is how do we participate in our movements, listening, engaging, learning, but also understanding that structures of domination are far harder to grasp than they were 150 years ago. There is a real role for intellectual work in the current struggles to imagine the new epoch. Please, sir.
We know that China is currently the major creditor of the United States. And the US is still number one. It's still the number one economy. But you are saying that...
Time is ticking.
Yeah, in 2060, you say that China is going to supersede the United States to become the number one economy. So how do you see the relationship between China and the US in the post-American?
Okay, see, it's an exaggerated thing what I told you. Because the other statistic which I didn't tell you is the question of final consumption. 1 full quarter of final consumption happens in the United States of world goods. 25% of energy is used in the United States, world energy consumption. So the United States is a massive, it's like the mouth of the planet. It's a gaping hole, all goods go in. So in that sense, unless demand is created from elsewhere, the dominance of the reliance, the Chinese rely on throwing credit to the United States to buy their plastic good. It is like a perpetual insanity machine. They are lending money to Americans to buy so they can buy the 20th TV in the house, made in China. But instead of turning transfer payments to rural China so people there can improve their livelihood. It is an insane machine. But what it's going to take is a very complicated fight. And I would say, honestly, that the most difficult place now in the next period where the struggle will happen is in the north. Because living standards are going to catastrophically decline. And that is when you have the turn historically to fascism, to the most barbaric forms of right-wing thinking. So, in a sense, the movements in the north need to very carefully figure out how to produce a soft landing for our populations. Okay, let me give you my favorite example of the insanity. You live in a house, and by the way, this is now in the global elite. You live in a house, this is my favorite example. You're freezing cold outside, so you heat your house, of course. Then inside your heated house, you have a refrigerator. Okay? Now, it's not even, the crazy part is not even come yet. Then in the refrigerator, you have a freezer. Okay. Now, in the freezer, you have a heating coil so that the ice doesn't jam up. So you have the house fighting against nature, with a box fighting against the house, with a heating coil fighting against the box. I mean, we are insane people. Why don't you just get an ice bucket, put your things and put it outside? You've short-circuited so much energy wasted. But we are crazy. So we have to, in a way, help our populations come to terms with the fact you cannot live like this anymore. If every Chinese house had 6 refrigerators, okay, what kind of planet will we live on? It will not exist anymore. So that is where our work has to go. We have to be, in a sense, shepherding. Now, you say, what will the rise of China? I mean, currently, the United States is using force projection to try to, I mean, there are 2 things the United States is doing. One economic, one not economic, one political economic, and the other military. Political economic is arguing your currency is falsely indexed to our currency. As if that is the problem. If the currency shifts, you won't get firms coming back for manufacturing in the United States. They will then go to where? To, Burkina Faso. They're not going to return to the United States. The labor is not willing to work like that. So regimes are going to have to change. So we have to be very clear that this should not become a US-China militarized conflict. That is, I think, the work of people in the North is to prevent militarism, prevent more wars, because that is the direction in which barbarism goes, and to prevent definitely a feeling of entitlement leading to the right gaining power. That we have to demonstrate that instead of entitlement, we live like lunatics. We should not be entitled to live like this. We should be entitled to live like human beings, not like lunatics. Yeah.
So, he started roughly in the 1920s. So, 1929, you don't really talk about it. There's a lot of comparisons being made between what's happening now versus 2006 and 1929. And so, like, I mean, I'm thinking of a little bit of some of the real presentation. I don't know if you were there, about the analogy between 50s.
Yes, in this morning.
Yeah, and anyway, so is there an analogy to be made? I mean, look at the way that the U.S. and Europe sort of recovered. I mean, Keynesianism and sort of a redeployment of the social democratic, or actually the invention and the application of the social democratic system. I mean, is that the answer?
Do you know anybody read the work of Giovanni Arrighi? I don't know anybody. There's quite a few people. He has a great book called The Long 20th Century. And then the next book is called Adam Smith in Beijing. What Arrighi does, which is, I think, very interesting, it's like Brodel, similar, but slightly different. He comes from a more materialist background than Brodel. What Arrighi does is he looks at long waves of certain indicators that are interesting. What are the indicators? One most important indicator for him is what happens to investment. So he shows that zones that are hegemonic, for instance, Italian city-states, the Dutch, then England, then the United States. For the period of their ascendancy, there is a priority of investment to go to so-called the productive sector, to industry. And then at a certain point, he says you start seeing a dip in industrial spending. And he calls that the signal crisis, when the dip occurs. And then finally, it reaches such a point he shows how these centers of capitalist hegemony have shifted over the last several centuries. And he plots the terminal crisis of the United States to the early 70s. And in a sense, I think there's something plausible there, because in the 1990s, the reason why the United States has been able to put off the reckoning, in a way, is the role of the dollar, which is not there with the pound in the same way, because they had the gold standard. It was not there with the Dutch. Again, there was gold, and other currencies were important in the planet. But today we live under what Peter Gowan called the dollar Wall Street complex, where everybody's wealth essentially is indexed, especially the oil money, the so-called petrodollars. Then the euro dollar market. Everybody is indexed to the dollar somehow. And there is no alternative mechanism for wealth generation and creation. So in that regard, the Federal Reserve in the United States operated as a way of producing money supply for the world, not just for the container of the United States. So you remember that Alan Greenspan, right through his tenure, was giving away money from the discount window of the Federal Reserve. If you follow Greenspan's career, he was the most liberal doler out of money to banks. And interbank lending was high, the money goes into investment. That oil, petrodollars that comes north, see what Witteveen wanted was a surplus recycling mechanism. Take the petrodollars, put them in the IMF, invest it in the IMF. Let the IMF give development loans to the South. That was Witteveen's idea. Instead, that was not allowed. The dollars then went in to create this enormous finance bubble. Then derivative markets, etc. Much of that financing comes from the South, oil-rich countries, and then debt repayment. And the dollar plays a big role to put off the reckoning longer. But there are the fundamentals in the northern economies switched in the 70s. That's what Schmidt recognizes when he says these industries are not viable. We are not capable of generating employment of a high level. So income inequality will grow. United States, until recently, wage levels were less than 1973 levels. There was a little blip a few years before the financial crash, but basically 73 levels onward. There's great stagnation of life for certain populations, but they were able to maintain their lives, their dream, through credit, not through wages. And that credit was the advantage of the dollar. So unlike Britain, which in the late 20s lost its hold on the world economy, the dollar was able to come in after Nixon. I mean, when Nixon in 71 will break away from the gold standard, the dollar takes on this amazing role, and it prolongs the life. So when you say 29, will there be a recovery? If you are looking at it in the long historical sense from Arrighi, it's unlikely that it can recover. Because to recover means you have to recover as a territory. The way it could recover, which is what I alluded in the last section, is the elite in the United States have already recovered. Because they are already benefiting from a deterritorialized wealth creation machine. But America is not going to recover. That's the big question. That is what this movement in the United States has identified intuitively. 1%, 99%. The 1% is deterritorialized. They can advantage the wealth creation machine, which is the planet. They are leaders at Davos, etc. They have operations everywhere. They don't need the territory to be coherent. What they require is the dollar to still have a role. So the dollar is now managed by the Fed to the advantage of wealth and not to employment creation in the US. You don't see monetary policy trying to create jobs. The government doesn't go in and force banks to lend for productive enterprise. Who did Obama choose for the jobs creation council he made? The head of General Electric. General Electric? Yeah, General Electric. This is the great deterritorializing firm. They have no to make jobs, American jobs. That is over. Unless you change the system. That's right. Yes, sir.
I really appreciated your reference to sort of bread riots as one of the factors behind some of these uprisings. I was thinking about, I don't know if you know Christian Ferenczi's recent book, Tropic Chaos, but he talks about these three factors that come together: Cold War, sort of munitions, structural adjustment programs, and climate change, creating these sorts of crises.
Combustive, catastrophic, what does he call it? Something like that.
Yeah, the catastrophic convergence, right. So that would suggest that some of the factors you identified behind the IMF riots are going to intensify. But he comes out with a very gloomy prognosis, sort of, collapsing state failure in the global South. So I wonder if you're on the same page or if you see some alternative, and particularly for this region.
I I'm not gloomy by nature, because human beings are dignified people who are always able to survive. I mean, look, the Japanese received 2 nuclear bombs and they survived. Okay, so, millions of people were wrenched out of their homes and taken as enslaved people, and they survived. They made lives and history. So I'm not by nature a gloomy person. Good things always come if you struggle and believe in life. So that's one thing. But I feel like he is correct, because what he is anticipating is that the reaction from the global gated community will be a kind of intensified security state against everybody. It's like these films that come out of Hollywood, which are real. There'll be there's an international corporate army that will clamp you down. It's more scary than a John le Carre book. And in fact, it's real. It's not a fantasy. Corporate policing, defense contracting, outwork, etc. People don't say this much, but one of the reasons the United States left Iraq is that they did not want to submit troops to the judicial review in Iraq. It wasn't some great thing from President Obama. It's that American troops can never submit to authority in another country. Come on, it's ridiculous. America has its own justice. Iraqi justice is a lesser form. So anyway, there are these forms of paranoid fantasy narratives that we have in our culture, which are actually quite close to the reality. That there may be a drone flying around this room, God knows, taping everything, taking retinal scans of everybody. I don't know. But my feeling is I don't care. Because however much security state they can do, people still seem to be resilient. You had a country that suffered, horrible security apparatus like Egypt, and suddenly, down with let the crowns fly in the air. People are resilient. So I read Christian's book, and I felt in the end, you read too many of these sauces. You didn't talk to enough people. People will smile, they'll be happy. So don't take the negative. People are always resilient. Yeah, one.
Vijay, two things. One is, how would the Arab Spring look different if we took more seriously your point about rural labor involvement and uprising in Syria, in Egypt, in Tunisia, in Libya? That's one. Then the second one is your thesis that the NATO and U.S. can't still be blocked. I wonder if that's not that there isn't a test case here of the resistance front of Hezbollah, Syria, and Iran, which are all under severe pressure. But if China and Russia and Brazil and so forth won't throw them to the U.S., wouldn't that maybe be a sign of a declining American hegemony?
See, that is an interesting question. But here's the question. Does the United States really want the Assad regime to fall? Because by certain analysis or theory, if the regime falls, the United States, as you and I know, is always wary of what comes after. Okay? When the protests began in Tunisia and in Egypt, the worry always was, what's next? Will it be the Brotherhood? When Wisner, my old friend Frank Wisner Jr., came to discuss very candidly with his beloved friend Hosni Mubarak, the fear was what happens next. Is there a transition plan? You understand? That is really the thinking. What's next? By my understanding, and I don't have the world's best contacts, but by my understanding, the sense is that the United States does not know what will happen next in Syria, and the United States' great friend, who also lives nearby, understands that unlike Lebanon, Syria does police its borders. And Syria has provided a great deal of security in the northern borders of our friend next door. So I'm not sure, actually, Juan, that there is fundamental pressure from Ambassador Rice. I think they are, at this point, my feeling, is hiding behind the Russians and the Chinese. And the Russians and the Chinese have their own interests, no doubt about that. They're not playing the stooge. They have their own interests. But I don't think the United States is eager to experiment in Syria, principally because I don't think they want an experiment in Syria. I think they have already seen how dangerous it is in Egypt to have let Mubarak go, and Tantawi now there, how stable is that border? And to risk this is very dangerous. So my feeling to you, and again, I don't have the world's best information, but my understanding is that it may not be so much pressure coming from there. So that's on the second. On the first question of the rural, I think it may not have changed what actually happened, but it changes our perception of what happened. You know, if we see these as urban revolts, hip young kids, etc., we miss decades of struggle by ordinary people to dent the legitimacy of the regime. That a college student sitting in Cairo, not to make light of the student, might have certain interests in the regime, certain privileges, you get to college, whatever, but the struggles in industrial areas, in Mahalla and Suez, port workers, this impacts lawyers. Then you have lawyers' struggles, doctors' struggles that break out, correct? I mean, it moves to professional people. This impacts the social climate in Egypt. It gives confidence to people. So if we just see this as a student uprising, we miss actually the social nature of an uprising. That it is a wider social delegitimization of the regime. So during the middle of the Egyptian uprising, I'm not an expert on it, but I did read that somewhere north of Cairo, there was a village where they had a big protest to commemorate a martyr who had died a few years ago in a police firing. These are monumental, moments of delegitimization. We remember that you killed our peasant leader. So I think it's our perception. Therefore, when a new Egypt is created, it better not forget the rural workers. It's not a bourgeois revolution only. It better not forget the Port Said dock workers, Suez dock workers. It better not forget in Mahalla the industrial workers. It is not the revolution only of middle class people. It's a wider, that's what I mean. In the same way around the world, the media is in the city. It will film in Tunis outside the government office, right? You think Soledad O'Brien or Anderson Cooper, they're going to go to some rural area and talk to them? They don't bother. They like being in the square. Look at me, I'm here, it's around me. If you go to some rural area, somebody not so skilled in talking to you, they have different emotions, they get upset, they get worried, they'll talk differently. The class barrier is enormous. Development economics is dead, largely. Okay, the agenda is moribund. We haven't even written its history. There is no good book that covers. People don't know who Raoul Prebisch is. It's a scandal. Prebisch was one of. Just this 2 years ago, a biography in English came on Prebisch by Richard Dossman, published by which great press? Queen's University Press in Canada. None of you, who has heard before of Raoul Prebisch? Honestly, 1, 2, 3. Some of you have, but not. He was the greatest development economist of a certain kind, conservative. Not a radical. In many ways, fairly conservative. Anyway, so development economics is finished. Now, Pardon? He was not a development economist. He was a theorist of power, I think. Anyway, but that's a separate thing. Say that today, in the Undersecretary of Economic Development in the UN is a very talented Malaysian economist by the name of Jomo Sundaram. Actually, he has a great name, Jomo Kenyatta Sundaram. But anyway, he publishes by the name of under the name of K.S. Jomo. Very good. Jomo has published 2 volumes of trying to bring together development economists from around the world who still exist, who are still alive. What is the agenda? They've created a network called IDEAS. I encourage you to visit the website, International Development Economists Association. They are trying to revive out of the old paradigm. See, what is a development economics agenda in a new geography of production? We can't just return to the textbooks on autarkic economy, building national development. We have already moved. So what is a progressive, maybe even socialistic-minded development economics in this new configuration? It cannot be nostalgia. It has to be a new agenda. That you have to train people. We have to fight against. I mean, economics as a discipline is now a sub-branch of mathematics. It is no longer a serious human science. Okay, it's that, or it's basically management studies. You know, I would like it if economics departments all joined the business school. And then inside social science, you created a new political economy program. That to me is the sensible way to go. It's not recoverable. They do not take an analysis seriously unless it has regression. And you and I will know regression is, you can prove anything. I mean, Freakonomics, he had an essay in there, just to give you the absurdity of it, okay? He wrote an essay in the book Freakonomics, funny book, where he argued that crime rates declined, just to be crude, crime rates declined in the 1990s because the Congress in the US passed Roe versus Wade in 1973. So because the poor could have abortions, there was less criminals in the 90s. Now that has a psychosocial assumption that unwanted children become criminals. So he doesn't investigate the unasked assumption. So you can prove anything in regression. So that's what I feel, is that we need to struggle to produce a new kind of look, that going back, reading Arthur Lewis, reading, those is useful, reading Kalechki, useful, but it doesn't tell us anything about today. We have to learn from that, put it into history, and create a new agenda. Yeah, Mona.
Somewhat different. I wanted to go back to your narrative. And one thing that kept going through my mind as you were telling the story of the Prelude and the resistance that emerges from there is that you were relooking at nation states.
Correct.
But what about other non-state actors? I mean, you think of the Chiapas, you can think of the region of the Transatlantic Economic.
Yeah, let's leave the second one. Let's go to the Chiapas for it. But actually, let's leave Chiapas. Let's go to Villa Campesina, because that's a very interesting, it goes back to my interest in rural areas. Villa Campesina is created in the late 90s. They first start meeting as a rural international movement for rural workers in various places. First, their strength is in Latin America. And after several years, they decide that rather than try to organize internationally, they have to organize regionally. So have a regional campesina group in Latin America. Then they moved the office to, I think, Bangkok or Manila, maybe Bangkok. Build Asian region, build African region. The end of my book, Poorer Nations, the last chapter is called Dream History of the Global South. And the basic argument is that internationalism is a premature concept. That the idea of internationalism is too grand for our current condition. That we need to still struggle on either regional foundation, continental foundations, etc. So the Bolivarian project is a very interesting example. There they have created, as you were saying yesterday, the class, the Caribbean and Latin American Confederation was created toward it, but not simply that, not simply organizations. The Bolivarians have created a virtual currency called the Sucre, where they want to trade nation to nation without the mediation of the dollar. It's not a real currency, it's just a computer currency. So there are ways in which regional formations might be helpful. So here's a grassroots peasant organization which has come to the conclusion after a decade of struggle on an international foundation that they have to organize regionally. You cannot organize in the nation state because it's impossible, but you have to organize regionally. And they are putting pressure, I would argue, on the new so-called left or pink-tide progressive states in Latin America to confederate differently as well. So there is pressure like that. So that's why I feel like the call to internationalism is always premature in our moment. That it sounds good to say World Social Forum, but here's the interesting thing. Data from the World Social Forum shows that when it moved from Porto Alegre to, say, Bombay, maximum delegates in Bombay were from Asia. Maximum delegates in Porto Alegre were from Latin America. So then you move to regional social forum. Arab Social, Cairo, very important role. People don't talk about its role in this spring. Activists from different will meet each other. Detroit, so the region, the local, these are very important. I think we have to build to the international. The international is I think, is a horizon. It's not a strategic possibility today. So even Chiapas has become local. In fact, unbelievably local. Local to the point of like, what's his name? Gustavo Esteban. That kind of local. Anybody else? Arey yaar, we had the whole afternoon Palestine, Palestine, Palestine. Even now Palestine. Palestine, Palestine, Palestine. Palestine. What is the nature of it? But today, what a great discussion. Majid told us the Palestinians are tired now. They have struggled for so long. They are tired. Give them a break. Everybody else fight for them now. They have lifted so many yoke. The problem for Palestine may not, the struggle, that is a different kind of global struggle. Because there the foot throttling it is not only local. There are some times, that's why I said in the thing that one of the big problems is that people who talk about the demise of America don't actually fully want to talk about militarism. And, a project does not end so easily. Britain refused to allow the transfer of its hegemony. And you might want to argue that the long World War from maybe 1914 to 1945 was a world war over different people contesting the hegemony of Britain. Maybe. It could be an interesting way to see it. Similar thing happened when you move from the Dutch to the English. I mean, just to take Arrighi. Warfare is one of the characteristics of the sign of autumn. And I don't want to be too fixed on that model, but militarism is a serious issue. And people in the North who are there, that has to be the first thing that we have to confront, is a country that can spend $7.6 trillion in 10 years on expanding its security and military apparatus and fighting wars. That's unbelievable. Yes?
I guess you sort of answered my question. So you were talking about the distances earlier and what places look like because the enemy would identify those which sort of the hard and every answer with an empire.
No, different from that. Yeah.
Because later on you were talking about regional alliances, strategic regional alliances, right? And so are you seeing the strategic regional alliances as sort of the template and future?
Okay, but first, let me just say why this is not like Hart and Negri. I don't believe that power is diffused. I believe that finance capital is hard to identify. I believe that it's impossible to know who is finance capital. It is a much more abstract form of domination than, say, feudal capital. So that is a mystifyingly, it mystifies its appearance. But that doesn't mean that military power is diffuse. That is very concrete and congealed. And sometimes it operates on behalf of, it is like the puppet of a very hard to see mediation between surface power, military power, and finance capital's power. You'll say Goldman Sachs, this, that, we are against them. But on the other side of it, we have pension funds that are index investors. Okay, let me give you a little example of what I meant by abstract. Our pension funds in the North, until about 10 years ago, they were not allowed to invest in things like commodity markets. Why have food prices gone up? It's nothing to do with demography. Okay, I'll give you a very simple lesson in that. You have pension funds suddenly, by rules changing in commodity markets, such as at the Chicago Board of Trade, they allow index investors, pension funds, to enter. So the problem with investing, speculative investing in commodities, is speculative investors want to push up prices. Typically that's the thing. And then you will hedge against it. The volume that enters the commodity markets puts prices up 600%, 300%, and then the prices will collapse. So in 2008, during the oil price rise, all the politicians were saying it's got to do with supply, Middle East, this, that, nothing. Nobody was talking about index investing. Pension funds entering Chicago Board of Trade, commodities markets. So you allow speculators into food price area and they will make food prices go crazy. In the United States, that was not being discussed because the United States doesn't suffer from food inflation. It's not a net importer of food. But it suffers from energy inflation. Oil, gas prices will go up. Rest of the world suffers from food inflation. Hey, Egypt, which used to be self-sufficient in agriculture, is now a net importer of what? Unbelievable. The cradle of wheat imports wheat. It's unbelievable that the Egyptians need to import food. You know, the Nile. I mean, how can it be? It's not a demographic issue. So in that sense, capital is very hard to identify. It's mystified behind, so the appearance is different from what is occurring. That's what I meant by that. I didn't mean in the Negri heart sense. Military power is much easier to identify. But military power, given the huge asymmetry of military power, is very hard to combat. You know, you have Taliban fighters. They may carry the most sophisticated machine guns, but they are just points of heat on a computer screen in Las Vegas. And somebody fires a missile and they're dead. They don't even know it's coming. They can't see the adversary. That's not war. That is just a video game. So when we talk about resistance, and if you're resisting against this kind of military force, you have to be either desperate or insane. That's what I meant. That military force is concrete, but it's very hard to fight it. You know, if you're fighting it when it's fighting in this kind of way. Yeah, Sohail?
Yeah, I wanted to wonder how you mentioned about how this kind of nexus between military power and kind of economic shifts played out, kind of maybe converged on Libya particularly, and whether you see that potentially as a new template for kind of NATO/US powers in the world.
Well, I'm happy to tell you that in March, I have a book coming out from the very fine anarchist press, AK Press, called Arab Spring, Libyan Winter, which narrates my interpretation of Libyan history. I first went to Libya as a little boy. I had the privilege of going by car from Alexandria along the coastal road. I don't know how many of you in the early 70s went to Libya, northern Libya. What amazed me was that on the side of the road, there were these remnants of World War II. In Tobruk, there were tanks sitting there, half tracks. I don't know how anybody driven that coastal road. Because Libya, until the early 70s, its biggest export was esparto grass, which was for paper, and then second was scrap metal from the war. I mean, it was a miserable economy. So anyway, my book tells the story of Gaddafi's emergence and then the degeneration of Gaddafi, not long after the emergence. But yet, when Gaddafi comes to power in 1969, you will remember that it was essentially a walkover. And nobody was going to fight for King Idris II. Okay, some pockets were there, but not really. I mean, they had history in their palm. And they had some interesting ideas, but it went in another direction. At any rate, of course it was interesting. It's not just Libya, it's Bahrain, it's the totality. I mean, today from Syracuse, Khalil, Osama Khalil, yeah, not here, but he gave a great paper which laid out, effectively the counter-revolution, as it were. For years they've been saying that GCC will be the Arab NATO. And, welcome to the projection. And, it's a complicated story, but to be fair, I think it's a new form of power. And, today they were saying in the earlier panel, I'm just repeating from the earlier panel, but it's also my sense that there has been a shift from authoritarian military, which was the Huntington model. Huntington had written a book in, 61, 62, The Nature of Power in a Changing Society, I think, 1961, 57, somewhere around there, in which Huntington put out, I think, very sophisticatedly the theory of military modernization. The argument was that in these misbegotten colonial countries, the old colonialists never allowed any institutions to develop that were modern. But the only one they allowed was military. So if you want to modernize along the grains of Rostow, your basic ally is the military. So it was not an accident that then the United States makes alliance with military dictators in Pakistan, elsewhere, because that was the modern institution. In fact, the legacy of that in Pakistan is enormous. Because even in the Pakistani elite, there's the idea that, well, the military, Musharraf drinks whiskey, has Pomeranian dogs. He's like us. He's not like a bearded mullah. He's a military modernizer. That was Huntington's thesis. That thesis is no longer applicable because from, I think, Latin America, there was a beginning of delegitimization. Juntas were removed, popular power comes. And, in a sense, this world is part of that process, delegitimizing these military regimes. And it's ongoing. In Egypt, it's not over, ongoing. But new forms of capillaries of power, as it were, are developing. And those have been husbanded or prepared previously. The GCC was formed precisely after the Iranian Revolution and the construction of the Islamic Republic. I think GCC was created in 1981. In fact, in Pearl Square, that monument was for a GCC summit that they then blew up, right? Wasn't that for a GCC summit? Anybody know that? In Manama? There was the monument, the white monument, that was to commemorate a GCC summit. It was created, I think, in 1981. That is going to play an important role. And I don't know how much independence it has. That's a question for another day. We'll see. In Saudi Arabia, the next crown prince is a very interesting person. You should pay attention to him and the route they will chart for the region.
One more question.
Fine. Something hopeful. Yes, good. Okay. Baki hai lahu dil mein to har ashk se paida rang. Okay, tell me. Some fairs coming in once in a while.
Yes, always more poetry would be a blessing. But just to, I'm curious to take you up here on your idea of how do we imagine beyond just resistance or just beyond the current moment. And you're talking so much about finance. I have two questions. One is, what type of finances and currencies between local people who, that are non-physical, who see development, in terms of, that are both returning to old ways as well as moving forward, human interaction, human potential, economies of emotion, if you will. And how do we name those and develop those so that way as we're growing, it's not just on an intellectual level, it's a personal level. On the second level is on the question of finance in terms of not being able to identify all forms of currency or even name all forms of existence that exist. I'm curious to how you see, or if you see a growing cyber, you could say, warfare from the people against virtual systems as anonymous grows and other forms of virtual hacker grows. And what do you see the implications of that being spread globally, of people trying to actually take it to the individual?
Okay, he said only one question. So, just kidding. So I'll answer the first one. Anyway, no, the question you ask is important, but let's take it in a differential way. So I think it's important not to romanticize poverty. I'm not like Prince Charles, who goes to the biggest slum in the world in Bombay and says, look, the people are so nice to each other. This is a great thing. We must not romanticize poverty at all. But it's true that in places where we live highly commoditized lives, new forms have already emerged. There are new ways of constructing systems of exchange. Okay, for instance, I live in a paradisical place where there are bicycle collectives that collect trash, there are cooperatives that run coffee shops, they exchange, barter all the time. People barter all kinds of things. It's very healthy in the north. In overconsumed areas, we need to promote more cooperative economies. That's the first thing. But that's not a model necessarily for everybody. It's a hell of a thing for NGOs to show up in highly impoverished places and tell people that they should be poor. So I'm not with that. I would like NGOs to go to Manhattan and tell people to live poorly. Okay? So that's why I said differential. Second thing is there's a very good book written by an economist, Nancy Fahlberg, called The Invisible Heart, where what she tracks, and she's not the only one, but the book is good. She tracks unpaid labor, meaning emotional labor, as you said, wages of emotion. So I'm interested in the new statistical projects that have emerged. There was a UN commission on this called a mismeasurement, of maybe man, badly put, but mismeasurement of man. But there are new ways of trying to understand what people do to survive as people. Because if we only see the waged economy, we don't get what people are already doing to survive. Representation plays a huge role in helping us reimagine the future. If we don't know what we're already doing, we won't know how to live tomorrow. If we deny to ourselves what we do today to survive with each other, we won't imagine other economy. We'll only be thinking about wages. So this project of trying to understand what is in an effective way is going to help us. For instance, the government of Bhutan has created an index of happiness, gross national happiness. I think that's a very interesting development. How do you find people's happiness? How do we define that? What are we... I feel depressed, I go shopping. I shop, I'm depressed about what I bought. I eat a hamburger, I'm depressed. I eat to satisfy myself, that makes me sad. So what is happiness? These are very important questions for civilization, I would suggest. So those are two ways I'd approach you. I think that idea of how do we catalog emotions is important, and the currency of it, very important. We spend most of our energy dealing with each other rather than mediated through commodities. But we don't recognize that as life all the time. When we plan for the future, we always plan thinking about commodities and the commodity form. So sometimes we already have, as a second question, what can I say? Of course, that's already, you named all the actors. There are interesting things happening, but I don't even know if the internet I can access is all that there is. I feel sometimes like, I'm walking on, 1/1,000,000th of the planet internet, and that there's huge spaces that nobody has welcomed us into. So I don't even know what there is potentially to hack. And I don't know if Anonymous knows either. We don't have a map of the internet. So we don't know what to fight. So until we need to track these things. So that's it. Okay? Great. Thank you.